And I do not want to betray his trust even in death.
What would be betraying his trust?
At 88, Ann-Margret finally breaks her silence about Elvis Presley, and what she reveals feels surprising and deeply personal. She says the man the world loved was not the same man she truly knew behind closed doors. What really changed? What truth stayed hidden all these years? Why speak now? The woman he never forgot. She was never the loudest person in the room. That was the first thing people noticed about Ann-Margret, and the thing they least expected, because on a stage she could shake the walls. She could make a crowd forget to breathe. But off the stage, she was something else entirely. She was gentle. She laughed easily, freely, the way children do. She listened when people spoke to her, really listened with her eyes as much as her ears. She had warmth that did not perform itself. It was simply there, and steady and quiet, like a lamp left on in the window. By the time she reached her late 80s, that warmth had not gone anywhere. It had only deepened, the way good wood does with age. She moved a little slower now. She took her mornings gently, and on one particular morning, she sat by a window with her coffee gone cold, watching the light shift across the floor, and she thought about him. Not because she had planned to. She never did. He arrived in her memory the way he always had, suddenly, without warning, filling all the space. Elvis. She had been 21 when she first walked onto the set of Viva Las Vegas. It was 1963. She was already a star, already the girl everyone was watching, already someone the cameras loved. And yet, when Elvis Presley walked across that same set and their eyes met for the first time, and as something inside her shifted in a way she had not expected and could not quite name. He was 28. He was, by any measure, the biggest thing in the world. His name alone could stop traffic. But what struck her was not any of that. What struck her was how he looked at her. Not like a prize, not like a co-star to be managed, but like a person he genuinely wanted to know. He smiled, and it was real. He said something that made her laugh, and that was real too. He had this way, she would later say, of making you feel like you were the only person in the world. There was electricity between them from the very first day. Anyone on that set could feel it. The director could feel it. The crew could feel it. It was the kind of energy that does not come from effort. It simply exists, all between two people who are somehow tuned to the same frequency. They were different in many ways. She was Swedish-born, disciplined, trained in dance from childhood, meticulous in her craft. He was from Mississippi, self-taught, instinctive, a force of nature more than a product of schooling. She was private by nature. He was surrounded at all times, a man who could never truly be alone. And yet, they were the same where it counted. Both of them had clawed their way to the top from nothing. Both of them understood what it meant to be watched, to be wanted, to carry the weight of other people's expectations. Both of them, beneath all the glamour, were still just young people trying to figure out who they were. What grew between them over those months of filming was not easy to explain to the outside world. People tried to reduce it to gossip, to headlines, to something simple. But it was not simple. It was the kind of bond that forms when two people recognize something true in each other, something they do not have to explain or justify. He called her Rusty, a nickname that came from her hair. She called him by his name, just Elvis, plain and direct the way she did everything. They talked for hours, about music, about where they had come from, about what it felt like to stand on a stage in front of thousands of people and feel somehow completely alone. They understood that loneliness in each other. They did not try to fix it. They just sat with it together, and that was enough. There are some people you meet, she once reflected quietly, and you know right away that they are going to matter. He mattered. He mattered in a way that was deep and lasting and impossible to simply switch off when the cameras stopped rolling. What they shared was more than chemistry on screen, more than the thrill of young careers colliding. It was something that lived underneath all of that, a tenderness, a true caring. The kind that does not ask anything in return, and because of that, it would also hurt. The world, of course, was not content to simply let them be. The world had opinions. The world had expectations. Elvis had a manager, Colonel Tom Parker, a man who understood commerce far better than he understood hearts. Parker saw the relationship, and he worried. Elvis's fans were devoted in the way that borders on possession. They wanted him for themselves in the way that fans sometimes do. Not the real man, but the idea of him. A public romance. Maybe Parker believed was a danger. There were other pressures too. Elvis's mother, Gladys, had passed away just a few years before, in 1958, and her loss had carved something out of him that never fully healed. He carried grief the way some people carry an old injury, quietly, accommodating it, never letting it show too much. Ann-Margret saw it. She never looked away from it, but grief of that size changes a person in ways that even the people closest to them cannot always reach. Fame, too, was doing its slow work on both of them. It was making things complicated that should have been simple. It was putting cameras where there should have been privacy, and opinions where there should have been only the two of them. The thing that had felt so natural, so free, and in those early weeks on set. It was beginning to feel like something that had to be protected, managed, explained. She did not yet know that year how much more complicated it would become. She only knew what she felt, and what she felt was real. Back by the window, all these decades later, Ann-Margret set down her cold coffee and looked out at the quiet morning. The light had moved across the floor while she was lost in thought. The room was still. The world outside was unhurried. She thought about the girl she had been then, young and bright-eyed, stepping onto a film set with her whole life still ahead of her, not knowing what was about to walk through the door and change everything. She did not think about it with sadness, exactly. It was something more complicated and more tender than sadness. It was the feeling of holding something precious, something that did not belong to her anymore, that perhaps had never fully belonged to her. And being grateful still, after all of it, to have held it at all. Outside, a bird settled on the ledge and then was gone. She watched the empty ledge for a moment, then looked back at the room. Some things, she had learned, do not need to be resolved to be worth carrying. Some things simply need to be remembered, honestly, gently, and without letting go. Love in the shadow of fame. From the moment their relationship became known, it stopped belonging to them. That was simply the reality of who they were in 1963. Two of the most recognizable faces in the world on the same film set, clearly drawn to each other. The press did not need much more than that. Photographers appeared where they had not been before. Columnists wrote with great confidence about things they had not witnessed. Fans, passionate and possessive, watched every interview for clues, read every quote for meaning, and formed strong opinions about a relationship they had never been inside. Every lunch together was a story. Every moment they stood close on set was an image someone wanted to capture. There was no such thing between them as an unremarked moment. Even silence had an audience. Ann-Margret had learned by that point in her career how to hold herself in public, composed, gracious, careful. But this was different. This was not just managing her own image. This was trying to protect something real and tender while the world pressed its face against the glass. Boom, she felt it every time they were photographed together. The look in her eyes had to be measured. The warmth she felt had to be rationed in public, saved for private. It was exhausting in a way she could not fully explain to anyone who had not lived it. And for Elvis, the pressure was heavier still. The world had a very clear idea of who Elvis Presley was. He was the king. He was the swivel of the hips and the curl of the lip and the voice that had come out of nowhere and rearranged the world's understanding of what music could do to a body. He was dangerous and exciting and larger than life. His fans did not simply admire him, they needed him. Or rather, they needed the version of him they had built in their own imaginations. That version of Elvis wore the crown easily. He was confident, commanding, untouchable. The Elvis that Ann-Margret knew was something else. Behind the doors that closed out the photographers and the handlers and the noise, he was quieter. He was curious, genuinely, almost boyishly curious about ideas, about people, about the world. He read. He asked questions. He could be wonderfully, unexpectedly funny in the way that only people who are also very gentle tend to be. He was someone who noticed when others were hurting and found quiet ways to acknowledge it without making a production of it. He was also, beneath everything, still deeply marked by loss. His mother's death had not left him. It had settled into the architecture of who he was, showing up in the way he sometimes went still in the middle of a conversation. In the way he held on to the people he trusted with a kind of quiet fierceness. He did not talk about it often, but Ann-Margret could feel it. She did not pretend otherwise, and she did not try to talk him out of it. She simply stayed. He was so much more than what they wrote about him, she said once, carefully, the way people speak about things they have spent years trying to find the right words for. She meant it. Between them, there were moments that belonged to no one else. He had a way of finding her across a crowded room, not dramatically, not with any performance attached to it, just a look that said, "I see you," in a language that did not need translation. She remembered those looks the way you remember something you did not know you were saving until much later, when you realize how much it mattered. There were conversations that went long into the evening, the kind that start with something light and end somewhere deep, where two people discover, almost by accident, that they understand each other in ways they have not been understood before. There was laughter. Easy, unguarded laughter, the kind that does not happen when you are performing a version of yourself. There was also silence, comfortable, undemanding silence. That, she always felt, was the truest measure of closeness. Not what two people say to each other, but what they do not need to say. Those moments were gifts. She knew it then, and she knew it more clearly now. But even as she received them, she could feel the edges of something pressing in. The world outside those quiet evenings was not going to wait. Colonel Tom Parker was not a sentimental man. He was a businessman, and his business was Elvis. The image, the brand, also the carefully managed myth. A serious public romance complicated things. It gave the press a new narrative to run with. It gave fans something to feel threatened by. Parker made his concerns known, not loudly, not cruelly, but clearly. There were also older commitments in Elvis's life. Connections and expectations that existed before Ann-Margret, that had been quietly assumed by the people around him to be the shape of his future. The details were not always spoken plainly. They did not need to be. She was perceptive enough to feel their weight without being told. And Elvis himself was not a man who found it easy to push back against the structure that had been built around him. He had people who depended on him. He had a world that had been organized, over years, around a certain version of who he was supposed to be. Stepping outside of that was not simply a matter of wanting to. It would have required dismantling something that a great many people had a stake in keeping intact. She watched him navigate this and said nothing that would make it harder. That was the kind of woman she was, but she felt it, the slow arrival of distance, not a dramatic break, not a single moment she could point to later and say, "There, that was when it changed." It was softer and sadder than that. It was the way warmth can gradually leave a room, without anyone opening a window. A shift so gradual you almost miss it, and then one day you realize you were cold. She would not have traded any of it. Not the beauty of what they had shared, not even the ache of what began to pull away. She was not built for bitterness. She was built for honesty. And the honest truth was that something real had existed between them. Something that no amount of outside pressure had ever fully managed to touch. What they had in those quiet moments, behind the closed doors, away from the cameras and the columns and the noise, that had been true. She held on to that. She always would. But even true things she had learned can be pulled apart by the world. Even real love can be slowly outweighed by obligation, by fear, by the enormous grinding machinery of other people's expectations. The question she could not yet answer, sitting in the middle of all of it, was whether what they had was strong enough to survive what was coming. She hoped, she believed, she waited. And somewhere on the other side of all that noise, she suspected Elvis did too, what the spotlight couldn't hold. Ann-Margret began to notice these things in Elvis during their time together. And she noticed them the way only someone paying very close attention could. The world saw the performances, the poured out energy on stage, the charisma that seemed to have no bottom, the way he could walk into a room and rearrange the gravity of it. What the world did not see was what happened after. After the crowds had gone, after the noise had dropped away, there was sometimes a stillness in him that felt less like peace and more like exhaustion. Not the ordinary kind that sleep fixes, something older and harder than that. He had been performing in one way or another since he was very young, performing strength, performing certainty, performing the king that everyone needed him to be. And performing takes something from a person, slowly, over time, in ways that are not always visible until a great deal has already been taken. He carried his mother's absence every single day. Gladys Presley had been the fixed point of his life, the one person for whom he had never needed to perform anything. Her death in 1958 had removed something from the center of him that nothing and no one had been able to replace. Ann-Margret understood this about him. She never tried to fill the space. She only tried to sit near it without flinching, and that, she sensed, was what he needed most. But the weight of it was visible, if you knew where to look, in the way he sometimes went quiet mid-sentence, as though he had followed a thought somewhere private and not fully come back. In the way he could be surrounded by a room full of people and still look, in some essential way, alone. That he had a sadness in him, she once said, almost to herself. A real one, not for show. And then the communication between them began to change. It was gradual, like so many things between people who care about each other. It did not arrive with a declaration or a confrontation. It arrived as absence, a call that came less frequently, a conversation that stayed on the surface when it used to go deep. The ease they had once had with each other, that rare, unhurried ease, began to require effort. And when connection requires effort, something has already shifted. There were things she wanted to say to him and didn't, because she was not the kind of woman who pushed. She believed that people had to come to their own truths in their own time, and she had too much respect for him to try to force what was not ready to be forced. So she held the words. She kept them in the space between what was said and what was felt, which was growing wider by the week, and he, she believed, though she could not be certain, held things too. Elvis was not a man who found it natural to surface the difficult feelings. He had spent too many years being the answer for everyone around him, the one who lifted the room, the one who carried rather than was carried. Vulnerability, for him, was not something that came without a cost, and the more the pressure of his world increased, the higher that cost became. What had once been a place of refuge between them, that private, real, unhurried space, began to feel harder to reach. Not because the feeling was gone. She did not believe, then or later, that the feeling was gone. But feeling is not always enough to hold two people together when the world is pulling in different directions with everything it has. There was no single moment. She would have said that plainly, if asked. There was no fight that ended things, no door slammed, no word spoken that could not be taken back. What happened between them was quieter and, in its own way, more final than any of that. There was simply a day, or perhaps a season of days, when it became clear that the paths they were on were no longer moving toward each other. His world had its own logic, its own demands, its own long-standing architecture of obligation. She had her own life, her own career, her own future unfolding ahead of her. And somewhere in the space between those two truths, what they had been to each other began to settle into the past tense. He married Priscilla Beaulieu in May of 1967. Ann-Margret learned of it the way the rest of the world did. She did not speak publicly about what she felt. She was inbuilt for that kind of exposure. She kept her feelings where she had always kept them, inside, handled privately, with the quiet dignity that had defined her from the beginning. But she felt it. Of course she felt it. There is no clean way to absorb the news that someone you loved has formally chosen a different life. Even when you understand it, even when some part of you knew it was coming, it still lands. She did not collapse. She did not perform grief for anyone's benefit. She simply continued, the way strong, graceful people do, carrying what she carried and letting the world see only the surface. What she was left with was not bitterness. She was too honest for bitterness and too fair. She understood the forces that had shaped what happened between them. She understood the weight of Colonel Parker's hand in Elvis's life, the way obligation and image had long since wound themselves around his choices. She understood that loving someone does not always mean you get to keep them, that sometimes love exists fully and truly and still does not survive the world that surrounds it. But understanding does not dissolve the unanswered questions. And she had those questions she never asked aloud that had no answers even if she had. Whether things might have gone differently under different circumstances, whether he had thought about her the way she, from time to time, quietly thought about him, and whether what they had been to each other had mattered to him the way it had mattered to her. She suspected the answer to that last question was yes. She held on to that suspicion gently, without demanding it be confirmed, without needing it to be anything other than what it was, a quiet belief, kept privately, never proven, never disproven. How do you move on from something that never truly felt finished? She would have said, and she would have meant it, that you don't entirely. You don't move on so much as you move forward, carrying it with you, lighter over time, but never quite weightless. You build a full life, a rich life, a life with genuine love and joy and purpose in it. She did all of that. She built it beautifully, but you also keep, somewhere, a small intended space for the things that mattered and were never resolved. Not out of sorrow, not out of regret, simply out of honesty. Because some things deserve to be remembered clearly, without revision, as they actually were. What she and Elvis had was real. It was complicated and pressured and ultimately incomplete. But it was real. And real things, even when they end without ceremony, without closure, without a final word that wraps everything neatly. Real things leave a mark. Hers was quiet. It was warm. And it was, in the deepest sense, entirely hers. The truth she kept for herself. From a distance, she watched the years shape Elvis's story into something she barely recognized. She watched the performances grow bigger and more elaborate. She watched the jumpsuits replace the simplicity of the early years. She watched him be turned, gradually, into something more monument than man. A symbol, a myth, a product of other people's needs and other people's imaginations. The world consumed him with enormous appetite, and very little care for the actual human being beneath the spectacle. She saw the toll it was taking. Even from far away, she could see it. The man she had known, the quiet, curious, deeply feeling man who read and laughed and listened and ached for his mother, was being buried beneath an image that had its own gravity, its own demands, its own relentless appetite. And there was no one powerful enough, or perhaps no one close enough, to pull him out from under it. When he passed away in August of 1977, she did not speak publicly. She attended his funeral, dressed in black, her face composed with the careful dignity she had always carried. She paid her respects in the way that people pay respects when the grief is real, quietly, without performance, without words that the crowd could clip and quote. She grieved privately. The world would never know the full measure of what the day cost her. Decades passed. The world continued to tell Elvis's story. In documentaries, in biopics, in books, in songs written about him by people who had never been in the same room with him. The story grew larger every year. The icon solidified, the myth calcified. And somewhere inside all of that, the actual man receded further and further from view. At 88, something shifted in Ann-Margret. Not anger. She was not an angry woman, had never moved through the world with bitterness in her hands. It was something quieter than anger and more purposeful. It was the feeling that time was finite, that honesty had its own dignity, and that the man she had known deserved, at least once, to be described as he actually was. She spoke carefully. She chose her words the way she had always chosen everything, with intention, with feeling, without excess. "That wasn't the man I knew," she said simply, when pressed to respond to yet another sweeping, simplified portrait of him. She did not elaborate wildly. She did not unpack decades of feeling in a single interview, but the sentence carried everything inside it. The way a small stone dropped into still water carries its ripple all the way to the edge. What she wanted people to understand was not complicated. She was not trying to dismantle the legend. She knew the legend had its own life, its own momentum, its own importance to millions of people who had found something genuine in his music, in his voice, in what he had meant to the world. She did not want to take any of that away. She only wanted to add something to it. A dimension, a humanity, the simple radical insistence that underneath the crown and the spectacle and the myth, there had been a real man. Imperfect, feeling, trying, hurting. And that man had mattered. He had been gentle when no one was watching. He had been funny in the unperformed way that reveals real personality. He had been capable of a tenderness that his public image had no room for. He had carried wounds he never showed the crowd. He had loved and been loved outside the reach of the cameras, in the ordinary and extraordinary private spaces where real life actually happens. He was a real person, she said, And in those 4 words was everything the myth had spent years obscuring. She was not asking for recognition. She was not settling scores or seeking sympathy. She was simply, at 88, standing in the truth she had carried for 60 years and saying, to anyone willing to truly listen, that she had known him, not the icon, not the performance, him, and what she had known was worth remembering honestly. There is something both beautiful and sorrowful about a love that the world never fully sees. It exists without witnesses. It carries no official record. It lives only in the memory of the people who shared it, and when those people are gone, it goes with them, unmarked, unarchived, returned quietly to the silence from which it came. But while she was still here, while her memory was still clear and her voice still steady, like she wanted it known that it had been real, that he had been real, that the story between them, incomplete, pressured, unresolved, deeply felt, had been one of the true things in her long and genuine life. In the end, perhaps the real story was never meant for the world at all. Perhaps it belonged only to the 2 of them, to the young woman with the red hair who could see past the performance, and the young man from Mississippi who led her. Perhaps some love stories are not meant to be witnessed or documented or turned into headlines. Perhaps they are meant simply to be lived quietly and fully, and then carried forward in the heart of the one who survives.